door. Okay. If we could pick up with your grandmother.
Yeah, so my grandmother and grandfather were going every weekend to the theater. My grandfather would say to my grandmother, Shifre, take the bed sheet and let's go to the theater. Because the ritual of going to the theater was connected to crying. My grandmother had to have at least 1 hour of crying in the theater. Otherwise, she said she would not enjoy it. If a play did not make her cry, it was shallow. And this was her therapy. In the ghetto, there was theater. Somehow, it seems to me unbelievable, but there was theater in the ghetto of Vilna. And I went very often to the theater of the ghetto, and I saw some Sholem Aleichem plays and so on. And my first art teacher, about 2 weeks after we were liberated by the Russian army, my mother has already found for me an art teacher. He was the stage designer of the theater of Vilna. So instead of teaching me how to paint, how to draw and so on, he was telling me about the ancient Greek theater, and he decided to give me a very thorough education about theater. This has maybe also with the years given me the particular attraction to the theater, because I was, years later, I worked a lot for the theater. They doing stage design, and this is why I have this special relationship, I think, to the theater. It's very much in the imaginary world. It was a possibility of escape in the ghetto. I think this is why the theater was so successful. This is why it was so needed, because for a moment there was a miracle happening on the stage. The lights would go on, and there was a different world. There was a different reality. I don't think I've ever been as fascinated in a theater like in those evenings in the ghetto, when they were putting on Yiddish plays like Grünefelde, the Green Fields. There was a play, and there was 200,000, 200,000 of Sholem Aleichem. I don't remember all the plays, but I remember the fascination that I had with the theater.
Did you ever go to the library in the ghetto?
Oh my, I was a daily visitor at the library. I was a completely compelled reader when I was 7 or 8. I think by the age of 9, I was reading a book a day. I think by the age of 9, I practically finished all the children's literature that was in the Strashun library of the ghetto. When I was 10, and we were already liberated, my mother said, "My child, now you stop with those stupid children books and you read books for grown-ups." And I think this was all my education that I had. I mean, the first day of school, normal school that I did in my life was at the age of 15 on. Until then, it was reading.
Would you continue the story of the war years? When we left off, that really proper was after the exhibition.
Yes. Well, there was this exhibition, there was this existence in the ghetto, there was this complete dedication that I had to reading. I was reading for hours and hours every day, because it was also a world of escape. And meanwhile, of course, things were happening on the front, and the Germans started to retreat. And they were speaking more and more about liquidation of ghettos, where the Germans were disappearing, the ghettos were liquidated, and so on. And from the ghetto of Vilna, there were two groups of people sent out to camps that were outside of the ghetto before the liquidation. And fortunately, my father was working in a unit that was transforming army trucks, German army trucks, into cars that go on gas. I mean, on wood-burning gas. So this was a whole organization where they were creating certain tankers, and they were welding those tankers to the trucks and so on. And the people who worked in that unit were all sent to a camp called HKP. And this was a particular camp where families were brought. I mean, men, women, and children. The men were working on the trucks, on the transformation of the trucks. They were preparing the wood for the burning in the trucks. And the women were working on the reparation of German uniforms. So that I was among the lucky ones who left for the camp of HKP. I don't remember now how many days before the liquidation of the ghetto. And we were in those were two buildings, two very, very large buildings, a little out of town, but very close to town, on the periphery of Vilna. Two big buildings that I think were built on the turn of the century to house some very poor people. I remember very long corridors and tiny rooms like cubicles. And there we were for several months. The older children were working, but I think that I was 9 years old, and I certainly looked less. I was very thin and so on. I belonged to the ones that were left idle. So we were a group, I think, of, I don't remember, 30, 40 kids. We were just playing around the places where the grown-ups worked, until the day in which the Germans decided to liquidate the children, to take away the children. And I remember that it's a very frightening evening in which people came to say that trucks were waiting not far from the camp, and it was a very bad sign, a sign that they will come to get some people. And I think my parents did not sleep the whole night, and nobody slept. There was a terrible tension in the camp. And then the next morning, trucks arrived into the camp. And then they started to shout that all the women and the children should come out. And when the women and the children, the first women and the children came out, the Germans started to take away the children and throw them on the trucks, pushing away the women. They wanted only the children. And at that point, my mother, who was holding me by my hand and was walking towards the door, was stopped by a very good friend of hers, who succeeded to hide her daughter in a small room where the door was sort of hidden by some mattresses and wooden objects. A ladder was there and so on. She has, almost without saying anything, she just grabbed the two of us and brought us into that room, and she has closed the door, hidden the door again. There was either my father or his friend, who was the father of the little girl who was hidden with me, who remained outside. And when a German soldier with his rifle arrived to that place and he started to touch those objects that were hiding the door, they have put into his hand a gold 5 ruble piece and so on. He took it and he went away. And outside there was yelling and shouting, and there were shots because some of the women grabbed the German soldiers, screaming murderers and so on, and they have killed a few women there on the spot while they were throwing the children on the trucks. The children were crying. There was a terrible, terrible noise. All this was happening just a few meters away from where I was hidden in that room. And by, I don't know, an hour later, all this was over. They've searched the place. All the children were sent away. And we were about, I don't know, 2 or 3 survivors as children in the camp. So the great problem was what to do with us, with me, with that other girl who was saved. The other girl was older than I was. She must have been about, I guess, 13 or so. So I remember they've put on her lipstick, they've given her some shoes on very high heels, and they took her to work on the uniforms as one of the women of the camp. But what could they do to me? I mean, I was obviously a child. So they have wrapped me in some blankets and they've put me under a bed and said, you don't move. Now, the number of the inmates of that camp was a very precise number. Each one of us had to carry a number on a big round piece of metal hanging on his neck. And every day they would check the number of people. And if one was missing, they would shoot a few numbers before, a few numbers after, so that they have succeeded to create an atmosphere of such hysteria in the camp that everyone was looking after the other ones, so that nobody would leave the camp or escape from the camp, because if you were escaping from the camp, you were causing directly my death. But when the children action happened and a few women were killed and were buried in the camp, my mother took this opportunity to succeed somehow and get out from the camp. At night she got out somehow. There was this area where they were loading the wood that was cut and prepared for the trucks, and through that place somehow, most probably by buying a guard or so, my mother succeeded to get out. And I was hidden there under that bed. I think I was hidden there for about 2 days or 3 days. At night my father would take me out. He would make me move a little my arms, my legs, and then the danger was that other Jews inside would see this child who survived. They were mad. I mean, the people who have lost their children, they were like mad, and it was difficult to imagine what their behavior might be. The idea was that they will give me out immediately to the soldiers. So my mother succeeded to get out from the camp, and she succeeded to come to her aunt, who at that time was terrified of her situation, because started to be rumors that she's maybe half Jewish or somehow related to Jews and so on. But my mother got to her, and with her help and the help of the maid that was working for her, she sent her own scarf with that maid to the camp to give a signal to my father that there was a possibility of getting me out from the camp, and that she was waiting outside to take me. And at that time, when my father has heard from some of his friends that there was the signal, he came with a big burlap sack of the sacks that were used to fill up with the cut wood for the cars, and he has put me into this sack. He's take me on his shoulder, and there was a continuous row of men carrying those sacks like that near the place where I was hidden. So he came out with me on his back and joined that row, and we went through the whole camp, through the whole control of the Germans, with me in the sack, until the gate, where there were barracks, where they were depositing those sacks. And then I was left to wait there. They told me, you wait, and once we give you a signal, you'll know what to do. And so this was actually my last moment in which I did not see my father, but I felt him. I was on his back. He was carrying me, And at a certain moment, the inmates who worked there at the gate, they provoked a sort of a quarrel or something to take away the attention of the guards from the area where I was hidden. And the moment the guards went away to see what was happening, somebody took the sack and threw me out from this window, which was on the first floor, and told me, get up and walk. So I found myself on the ground. It was late in the afternoon, and since in the northern countries it's already rather dark, I could see the silhouette of a woman there, and I understood, with my mother's scarf. It was a white, red checkered scarf. So I got up, and she gave me a sign with her hand not to hurry, to walk slowly. So I walked slowly to her. She took me by the hand, and she says, now we walk very slowly. And we walked away from the camp. And after some while, she stopped a droshka, which was one of those cars driven by a horse. And we went to the home of my aunt, where my mother was waiting for me. It's an incredible miracle. All of a sudden, my mother saw me. She thought she will never see me. My father was then, about 2 months later, was killed in the camp. But we were then free, but there was no place to go. It was a very, very frightening moment, much more frightening to my mother than to me, I guess. Because when I think about it, many people went through terrible horrors, and children went through terrible horrors, and so on. I was particularly lucky that I had this very courageous woman, this mother who loved me so dearly. I had her all the time near me, or most of the time near me. I think this is what gave me this extraordinary power even to relate and to tell these things and so on, because it seems to me so miraculous, all this, so incredible. I must say it's like an Alexandre Dumas story. It's almost unbelievable. And yet she was there, and she was so loving, and she was so full of care and so on, that it's even possible, to live it again and again and again and again, and somehow even not feel too uncomfortable about it. Now, I would like to tell you maybe how it went on, but I don't know if you have to change the tape or so.
Let's take a break for a moment. Would you like some more to drink?
I'll drink.
Roll tape, please. So, we'll pick up from when you're now reunited with your mother, and you're at your aunt's house, and now the question is where to go.
So we were in my mother's aunt's house. We could not stay there. I think that one of the rooms of the house was living a German officer. She had to give that room to everyone had to give some space in his house to the German authorities. And she started to panic. And she found a woman who agreed to give us a shelter, a hiding. And the moment it became dark, she took my mother and me to that woman. And the woman has shown us a sort of, it was in the middle of town. It was very dangerous to walk like this. And this woman has shown us a tiny closet. There was absolutely no air in that closet. And she said, I hope the child is not afraid of rats. So my mother asked her, why do you ask that? She said, because until 2 days ago I had here somebody hiding, but every time that he was bitten by a rat, he screamed. So she said, I must be sure that nobody's going to scream here, otherwise... Well, it was obvious to my mother that we could not accept that type of hospitality. So we went out from there, and my mother told her aunt, who was really, I remember, panicking with our situation, that she has an idea. And my aunt went away, and then we walked through town. It was, I think, about half an hour or so before the curfew. It was already very dark. And we went on to one of the bridges, and we spent some time. My mother was looking into the water, and we were standing there and so on. And well, years later, my mother told me that she decided just to kill herself with me by jumping into the water. But she did not have the courage to do it. It was a moment in which she sort of lost courage, lost every hope of doing anything because everything seemed closed. And then at a certain point she remembered that she had heard that one of the nuns was released from the camp where they were arrested and came back to work as a guardian or a charwoman in the monastery, which by the time being was occupied by the German authorities as a place for archives and concentration of all sorts of archives of Russian towns. So this was it was the last straw, actually. It was the last straw, and she took me by the hand and we walked there. We walked very fast because the curfew hour was going to arrive, and we succeeded to get to that place, and my mother rang the bell of the door, and this woman opened, and she was absolutely amazed when she saw my mother and me, because she was sure that we were found by the Germans then in the monastery and killed on the spot. And she brought us in, and she told my mother to wait, and we waited and waited. We waited maybe more than an hour by ourselves in a little, very dimly lit room. And then she arrived with two men, and the two men were Jews. One of them was somebody whom I think my mother knew very well from before. He was Dr. Liebel. He was a physician. And the other one, I think, was called Yashunsky, was a known journalist. Now, they worked for months before, stocking all those books, and they have created a hiding for themselves and for their families in that monastery that became an area of storage of books. So between the books, they have created a space where they were hiding. And there was a defrocked Lithuanian priest who was coming a couple of times in the week with a little suitcase bringing some food. And the nun, besides that Lithuanian priest, was the only person that knew that there were some Jews hiding there. And she had the idea of asking them to receive my mother and me and to be part of this little group. And this is how we survived. This is how we survived, and we wouldn't have survived had there not been another miracle, the last moment miracle, which was when the war really came already, the real fighting, to Vilna. And the bombs were falling, and they were fighting for every street. A fire broke out in the building of the archives. And some books started to burn and bring out a lot of smoke. And there was a group of neighbors that were organized in a sort of self-defense and as firemen as firemen. They were supposed to save the area. And they started to break the windows of the space where we were because they wanted to handle the situation. And they discovered us. They discovered us, and all of a sudden we were there. There was another girl a little older than myself and I, and there were another, I think, 6 or 7 grown-ups. And we thought, this is the end. This is the end. We knew that 2 days before, some Jews were found nearby and they were killed on the spot. But this time we were not found by the Germans, we were found by the Poles. So the head of this group said, I'm going to bring the army. I don't know where he thought to bring the army because the Germans were escaping. But he rushed out from the monastery, and the moment he went out from the gate into the street, a blind ball got him in the stomach and he fell bleeding in the street. I don't know if he died on the spot or if he died a little later, but something happened to us, as if a scenario of an incredible drama of the 19th century has prepared this Deus ex machina, and this is how we survived. And 2 days later, the Germans were gone. Vilna was partly destroyed. Smoke was coming out from everywhere. Many houses looked just like garbage with an obelisk in the middle, which was just a chimney that remained. And we started to walk with my mother through this town, and there were dead soldiers who were not buried for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks, in a state of total decomposition, covered with flies and so on. And we walked again. Where did we go? To the house of my aunt. And my aunt was there. My aunt was there, and her 2 sons were there. One of these sons is my cousin who lives today in New York, and not far away from here. And this is how all of a sudden we were in a free world where we were not condemned anymore to expiate the fact that the Jews have killed Jesus. This was what I thought then, maybe the main reason for all that was going on. And my mother told me then, look, one thing you can finish is with your Christian religion. It's not necessary anymore. But I couldn't give it up. I love the smell of the church. I love the incense, and I love the music. So secretly, I still went on for a few months without telling anybody. I was then came to Vilna my aunt, who succeeded to save her little daughter, my cousin, who was much younger than I was, so she did not understand anything of what was going on. But very often I was taking her for a walk, my little cousin for a walk, her and her teddy bear. But it was always an excuse to go to a church and to smell the church. And, but I sort of grew out of all this quite quickly. But the story is not finished there, of course, because we were in the Russian part now of Europe. Sutzkever survived. A famous poet, Peretz Markish, who heard about this enfant prodige, this little Mozart of the Vilna ghetto, came to Vilna bringing some socks for me made of a wool that was so itchy that I could have never put it on. But my mother said, socks that Peretz Markish brought for you, you should keep them. One day you'll be very proud about those socks. I've lost those socks. And we still had to escape from there. Then the danger came, the great danger came that it was decided in Moscow that I was to be transferred to Moscow to a special school for very talented children. There was such a school then, talented in music, talented in chess, talented in painting, I don't know. And there my mother, after all that, after we realized that we were the only survivors. My father was shot, my grandparents were killed, my father's sister and her children and so on. There was nobody left. There was her sister, my mother's sister was there, but all of a sudden there, I was supposed to be taken away from her and brought to Moscow to be educated to be a great painter of the Soviet Republic. So she had to escape again. But we had to wait until the end of the war, until the summer of 45, so that she would be able to prepare all the necessary things that had to be done in order to get away from